You know, Star Wars and MASH. Not a combination I saw coming, honestly. So now I don't even get my cold opening to start. Yes, here you go. Here's your pets. Today's book is the Star Wars EU novel MedStar I, Battle Surgeons, written by authors Michael Reaves and Steve Perry. A common collaborative pair within the Star Wars EU, I've noticed. It takes place during the Clone Wars era of the Star Wars universe, specifically 2 years after the Battle of Geonosis, and is part of a duology series known as the MedStar series. This is also the book that debuted the canon immigrant Barriss Offee, although the two exist in such a different state of way that I would argue that they're probably not really the same characters anymore. Apart from that, there isn't much to talk about in terms of background for the book itself. Apart from, that's really it. I don't need to bring that part up. So, that being said, here's your ratings card. And now, we move on to the cover. Now, the cover for this book is pretty good. You got some cover art of Barriss Offee slicing a super battle droid in half. Well, kind of in half. Most of the way in half in the middle of a battle. That's pretty much it. You can kind of see some of the surroundings behind it, but it's blurred. The main focus is Barriss Offee slicing this droid in half. And while I like this cover, I like the art, I like the sense of action on it. If I had one complaint about this cover is it doesn't really tell you anything about what the novel's about. It does set the time period well. You have a Jedi slicing a battle droid in half. Therefore, you know it's going to be during the Clone Wars. Apart from the gigantic A Clone Wars novel description on there. But, however, I think it's weird that this is the one scene that they chose. This scene does happen in the book. But it's such a disconnected scene from everything else that the book is about that it seems weird that this is the scene that they chose to portray what their book's about. Which is, again, like a MASH crossover. So in reality, that's my main complaint. If they were going to draw any scene from this book, I don't know why they chose this one. And even then, I don't think it's completely accurate, but I may have read the scene wrong a bit, so good, but they probably could have done much better. On to the synopsis. Now, the synopsis of this book, which I did read in my TBR, if you're interested in me reading directly from the synopsis, go check it out there. Also check it out there to figure out the next 2 books I'll be doing. Sort of. But a quick synopsis for this is, like I said, it's basically MASH for Star Wars. This follows a small med unit known as Rimzu 7, as a group of battle surgeons do their best to keep clones and other various combatants alive on the world of Drongar. The Separatists and the Republic are currently fighting for control over the planet for a very special resource known as Bota, which can be turned into a sort of miracle drug off-world, along with many other uses. Now, the reason this place is so bad is because Bota is extremely sensitive to high temperatures, so they can't really fight with the standard ways they do, which is laser guns, which is their laser rifles. So they're using a lot of sonic pistols and ballistic weaponry, and because of that, we see a lot more of the issues in this part of the war that you would normally see that blaster fire wouldn't really contain. Now, this book is more of a sort of just, again, MASH. But more focused on the medical side than anything. You get to know these characters, why they do what they do. It's almost more of a character study of these various characters than it is a straight battle or anything like that. That's kind of why I say this cover is pretty bad. It promises the action that barely happens, as opposed to what this book's really about, which is the interpersonal and intrapersonal relationships of the people within this medical unit, as well as some other people outside of it, but I'll get to that. Now, this motley group of people includes the surgeons of Jas Vondar, a human from the Corellia system, who is struggling with his ancient traditions from his people, as well as his struggle to understand clones and as more than just simply organic droids. He's one of the people who is affected heavily by the war, although you would never really tell because he's a sarcastic, quippy guy. He is by far our main character more or less. He gets the most focus, getting the most POV chapters as well as a decent amount of focus in the chapters that he's not the POV as well. In addition to that, we have a Zabrak surgeon known as Zan Yant, who is from a very prestigious family and is by far the most traditional how you would expect the doctors. He's the kindest of them. And it's repeatedly pointed out that he could have become a great artist outside of this war. Then you have the character on the front, Barriss Offee, who is a Jedi Padawan sent here on a mission to sniff out some smugglers while pretending to be backup for the surgeons. You also have Din Dur, who is a war correspondent sniffing about for his story and sort of picked up something about the smugglers on his way through. You have a droid who gets into deep philosophical debates known as I-5. You have a empathetic, like an actual empath, creature known as Clo Merritt. I forget the exact name for his species, but he's like one of those horse face guys you see a lot, named Clo Merritt. And you have several minor characters like Tok Latrine. Doesn't really get a lot of focus, but is sort of the main object of romance for Joss. You have a character named Admiral Blade and a character named Foji, who sort of serve as our antagonist, more or less, as opposed to the general separatist antagonists. But apart from that, the book is mostly about the philosophical discussions of war and seeing a war from more of a doctor's point of view than it is the soldiers, as we often see in these Clone Wars novels. But before I start gushing about it a little bit, let's get into the review, at least properly, because I've already technically started. But I loved this addition to the EU. I actually love the combination. As much as I'm joking about it, the combination of the MASH style mixed with Star Wars was actually a fairly decent combination, I guess, just to repeat a word. Pretty much all the residents of MSLO 7 are very interesting to read. I really enjoyed I-5's philosophical debates because it's coming from him as a droid who has much more of a reason to contemplate his own humanity, for lack of a better word, and the humanity of those around him. My personal favorite character was Din Dur, the war correspondent, because he's one of the most active characters. He's probably the second character who gets the most focus apart from Joss. Believe it or not, Barriss Offee actually gets very little focus in a book that has her on the cover, in comparison to the other characters who get a lot of point of views. I would actually argue she probably gets less perspective than Admiral Blade, but I'll get into him. Even despite that, Barriss Offee is a refreshing take on a more subtle, careful Jedi who, as opposed to the more bombastic Jedis that we get in books like this. She's a character who is calm, calculated, almost a perfectionist to the point that she beats herself up for making small mistakes, even when in reality they really aren't that big of a mistake. She's one of the few people we see that struggle with the dark side. I-5 is also a really refreshing character too. I definitely think that I may be missing some information. A lot of what he talks about, hints at in his past, I feel like may have been from a previous book, just from the way it's worded. It's just too much information for something that seems like throwaway lines of his past. But I definitely enjoyed the philosophical thoughts that he has during those moments where they're all sitting down playing their poker game. Well, not poker, but I'm just going to call it poker for ease. And the fact that he struggles with the idea that despite being a droid, he's more or less both wants to feel human at times, but doesn't. There's actually a lovely conversation between him and Din Dur about him not being able to get drunk, and on one hand, while that's a benefit, he kind of wants to because he's tired of being constantly always mentally acute and kind of just wants to numb his senses for a little bit.
There are a lot of explosions for two people blending in.
Freeze! Right there!
You're right. I should just wait on the ship.
But that's not to say that a few of the characters don't have issues. Like I mentioned in the when I was my synopsis, more or less, I was kind of veering into review. The Dr. Tolk Latrine. Okay, so it's confusing because a couple of times they refer to her as a nurse, but she's also referred to as Joss's supervisor at one point, which is one of the reasons why he was hesitant to even try to pursue a romantic relationship with her, apart from his traditions and stuff. But she's referred to as a nurse, and if he's a straight doctor, that would technically place him on the hierarchy based on what I know about that. So that was a little confusing, but I think she's supposed to be a doctor. But one of the reasons I thought she was kind of wasted, apart from being apart from being Joss's object of desire and ultimate romantic goal at the end, she doesn't really get much characterization, and that's definitely an issue considering what she represents. The fact that Joss is contemplating breaking his tradition and potentially becoming exiled from his home system by falling in love with her. There was also Chloe Merritt, who I brought up, the horseface guy. And you don't really get much on him either, other than learning that he's a psychiatrist and he has empathetic abilities. So he kind of always knows what people are feeling. But apart from that, yeah, those guys don't really get too much characterization. Okay, but fun fact about the Tolk and Joss thing. I was actually worried that Barriss Offee and Joss were going to be the main romantic couple within this book. And, okay, so I know this isn't any fault of the book, but my first exposure to Barriss Offee as a character was within the animated Clone Wars series. And I know they're different characters, but there's I'm going to guess there's a significant age gap between Barriss Offee when she's in the Clone Wars and the Barriss Offee in this book. Namely that the Barriss Offee in the Clone Wars is like a young teenager, and so it was hard to divorce myself from that perception I had of her, which made the scenes where the authors put her underneath the male gaze kind of uncomfortable for me. And again, this is not a fault of the book. I'm not trying to blame the book for this. This is purely my own issue, but it did make those scenes more uncomfortable when I read it. But an actual complaint about this is that Barriss Offee gets subjected to the male gaze kind of writing for really no reason. Like, there's one scene where she meditates naked, and I can't for the life of me figure out why she was naked in that scene. She never is naked in any other meditation scenes. It's not explained away that she's casting off all physical embodiments of the material world so that she may better focus herself and ground herself on the Force. It's just, she's randomly naked in this scene for some reason. But honestly, if I had to say, the only character I find truly annoying, the only one I wish kind of just got less screen time and had just been, I probably could have lived even without his chapters, was Admiral Tarnee's Blade. Now, Admiral Tarnee's Blade is the Sakayan admiral placed in charge of the MedStar station currently floating above Drongar, which is, he's more or less our primary antagonist. There really isn't a very strong antagonist within this book, but Admiral Blade is more or less our primary antagonist, as he's basically the person running the smuggling operation that Barriss Offee was sent here to investigate. Okay, so he's running the smuggling operation for the Black Suns, and he gets a fair amount of chapters describing his motivations, his actions, who he is as a person, how he conducts himself, and all that. And I gotta tell you, unlike almost everyone else, reading his chapters is a chore. Like, oh my god. The easiest way to sum up almost all of the chapters told from his point of view is 75% of it is him stroking himself off, whilst 25% of it is him actually doing something to move the story forward. After a certain point, listening to this guy spout about his hunter and prey dynamics, how he's such a great guy that the Republic is wasting and looking down on, and that's why it's totally justified for him to smuggle. Why he's so amazing, and why his hunting abilities are so great, and how he's going to return home and create a pride and be one of the best people ever. It just, at a certain point, it gets annoying. Like, we get it. not every chapter has to repeat this information. It definitely worked for his character. I definitely got a good sense of who this character was, and it definitely fit. It was just annoying to read. I didn't really need a page describing the ship he flies, because he wants to prove how superior he is to most people because of the ship he drives. He's one of those people that is not fun to be in his head. And while I completely appreciate what Michael Reaves and Steve Perry were doing, I wanted less of him. Maybe it could have been better, but his plotline is almost pointless. He died. Okay, so spoiler alert. Skip ahead by like 30 seconds. But he dies at the end of the book. And he isn't even killed by any of the main characters. He's not found out by Barris Offee, who was the person sent to investigate. The only person who even knows that he was smuggling to the Black Suns was Din Dur. He basically dies at the end from a Black Suns assassin, who he kind of... Okay, so he not only... At no point do our heroes at all ever interact with his plotline. Barris Offee was sent to investigate the smuggling operation, yes, but she doesn't really ever investigate it. She takes a very much Anakin and Obi-Wan from Rogue Planet approach to it. I'm just going to hang around the area and hope something comes by. I'm not actually going to look into it. But pretty much Admiral Blade starts this, makes the problems for himself, and concludes his own plot line by himself against him. Yeah, pretty much everything Blade does affects only him. So there was also another subplot that was the spy subplot. Basically a spy. I don't know. Okay, so I was a little confused by this. At first, the spy subplot felt like it was someone who was personally trying to get revenge on Admiral Blade for something he might have done. But then later on, the dynamic is switched up, and now they're hinting that this was actually against all of the Republic. Hinting that now they're a separatist spy and a Black Sun spy too. Kind of working for whoever pays them, I guess. So that was weird, but the spy subplot feels sort of tacked on. Again, the spy subplot doesn't really ever affect anyone. At most, at the end, it implies that they sabotage some of the systems that causes the main final conflict, I guess. But there's never a hard confirmation, and most of their presence in the story is just, I'm just reminding you, there's a spy. And I guess technically they also poisoned another character, but again, it doesn't really affect the main cast of characters. So the whole spy subplot just doesn't feel like it was needed. And unlike the Blade subplot, it isn't wrapped up by the end, hinting that the MedStar II is probably going to be dealing with trying to find out the spy, which I hope is the case. Although there's no other way it can be anyone else but Clomerrit. Yeah, I've already figured out who the spy is. If I'm wrong, feel free to tell me, but based on everything I read, and this isn't to give the book credit, like, oh, they're hinting really well. No, like, the book gives you almost no hints at who it is, but through sheer way of reading it, it's Clomerrit, the empathetic guy, because it's the only person it can be. But yeah, apart from that, the book is actually really good. I don't have very much other negative things to say about it. Even the other antagonist of the book, Fo-Ji, who is a master martial artist, has a much more interesting plot line that I think holds up compared to the other two antagonists. He's basically a martial artist who joined the war he just likes to kill. And the war is his excuse to do so without repercussion. And we definitely see his thing more from the Doctor's point of view, which I really loved. Instead of being heralded as a war hero like the Republic wants to put him up as, Din Dur, the war correspondent, and the Doctors are horrified by his actions. As Doctors, as people who see both sides of the war as people fighting each other, it makes complete sense that they see Fo-Ji for the psychopathic killer that he really is. He's just out there to kill. He's not fighting for a cause. He's not fighting to stop the enemy. He's fighting for the pleasure of taking life. And it's just really interesting because every character has a different reason to dislike him for that reason. the doctors, obviously, because of the Hippocratic Oath, that life is precious to them. You got Dinder, who, based on a sad backstory, his backstory is actually really good. Why he's a war correspondent and why he's so dedicated to the truth at all costs, even if it's not pretty, is actually really interesting. I love it. But you also get why Dinder doesn't like him and thinks that his producer's trying to spin Fauji into this great war hero is a crime above all degrees. And Fauji definitely hides behind the idea that this is war. I mean, are you going to tell me off for defeating my enemy? That seems counterproductive. But again, it's just a really interesting look at it because they look at it mostly from the Doctor's point of view. One of the things that I definitely wish had gotten a little bit more attention throughout the book was Josh coming to accept and view the clone troopers as more than just organic droids. I know that was one of the big complaints back when Attack of the Clones first came out, and then later on Revenge of the Sith, was that despite the fact that a great deal of time was going to show these are clones, they didn't really act much more different than droids. So you had to ask yourself, why clones? Why not just use droids if they're going to accomplish the same purpose? And while I do think the animated Clone Wars series is a masterclass of fixing that issue,
we're soldiers. We do what needs to be done.
You know what makes us different from battle droids? We make our own decisions, our own choices. And we have to live with them.
I promise I'm not going to gush about the animated Clone Wars series every time I do a book review. I promise. The reason I say that this helped is because it shows that the clones just act like that because that's how they're taught to act, but deep down they're still people. One of Joss's subplots deals with him trying to understand the grief one clone has because another clone he was close to died. But a quick aside, in the way it fits into the EU, it does feel a bit off. For example, one of the things that this book confirms is that the Republic had a draft going on at the start of the Clone Wars, which sort of makes you wonder if they could do a draft and conscript doctors and soldiers, why are they using the clones? Because one of the things that I think even held over from the originals rather than being told in the animated Clone Wars was that the reason the clones were being used by the Chancellor Palpatine was the fact that they were expensive to make, and the reason they kept making them is he was able to convince the Republic, well, we could send you to fight, or we can make these clones bred to fight. So yeah, that doesn't feel like it meshes very well with the canon that I know. I may be wrong, mind you, but a couple nitpicks I did have. The rivalry between Barriss and Fauji felt a little forced. It just sort of feels like it was there to try to give both characters characterization by playing off each other, but it didn't feel like it was happening naturally almost. Obviously, Barriss actually starts the book almost kind of looking up to him because of his skills as a martial artist, but then later on seems to just dislike him immediately to the point where she uses the Force to trip him after being slighted. And while it does work on a sense that Fauji is kind of a dark reflection of what a Jedi could become with their Force powers, the enjoyment of killing and using their power over others because it feels good, I just felt that the actual rivalry that existed between them was a little forced. It could have been done more naturally. Another nitpick I felt that this book has is that it throws a lot of jargon at you and expects you to sort of know what it means. This was actually an issue I had with the Republic Commando series when I started to reread it a bit. Is that they throw a lot of jargon at you, and while in like real novels like take place in our world, this jargon could be forgivable because I mean you can look it up. It's stuff that exists in the real world and stuff like that. The problem with a lot of this jargon is it doesn't exist in our real world, so we don't have a frame of reference that even readers like me who want swimming in the deep lore stuff that I can just say this one character who shows up for the 0.3 seconds of the scene in Return of the Jedi is named. I can't tell you that. but like it feels like you can't just throw jargon out there and hope people understand when you're in a fantastical place like this. Like even futuristic works that throw jargon at people still have the basis of it's just us, but in the future. This is a completely different universe. We aren't on Earth. We aren't in the future for us. This is in the past in a galaxy far, far away. So the jargon kind of stumbled me a bit while I was reading.
You want to buy some death sticks?
You don't want to sell me death sticks.
I don't want to sell you death sticks.
A perfect example of this is the book throws back to... The book references something really obscure that I actually had to look up. To be fair, I didn't even look it up. I happened upon it and realized, oh wow, it was referring to something? Because when we're first introduced to Fauji, one of the things Barris tells us is he's just defeated a Jedi Master in a Terakasai Championship. Terakasai, for those of you who don't know, didn't play that weird Star Wars game way back when, is basically the Star Wars equivalent of martial arts. When she says that, I thought that was just a throwaway line telling us what happened. Or like referencing the game. No, it's actually referencing HoloNet News Volume 53155, a small little thing that Disney put out around the time I think Attack of the Clones was about... Not Disney. Hollywood was putting out around the time Attack of the Clones was about to come out, or after it had come out. Point is, it's a super obscure reference, sort of like the Cerberus network from Mass Effect. It's so obscure that you're like, what? Like I said, it's just one of those smaller things that can drill into you more as you read. Definitely a nitpick more than anything for me, but it is something I feel like I need to bring up to people who are going to go into this book. But yeah, that's more or less all I have to say on the book. So, 7 out of 10. Yeah, the book is really good, but I do find that the Blade sections are very annoying to read, and they do bring the book down quite a bit, taking time away from more interesting plot lines that could have been explored in more depth. And the spy subplot, although I'm sure it'll be important next book, felt very irrelevant in this book. Again, apart from two things that they had their hand in, I don't understand why they were really necessary for this book. And the way it's written, yeah, again, I will put $50 down on Chloe Merritt. The other nitpicks I mentioned brought it down a little bit, but overall it wasn't enough for me to drop it any further than 7. It was firmly an 8 out of 10 for most of the book, but the Blade sections, again, brought it down quite a bit. The irrelevant spy section by the end kind of brought it down a little bit more. But apart from that, yeah, it's a really good book. Honestly, someone should pitch this to Dave Filoni and, see if he'll make it another animated series detailing Star Wars MASH. But the question, does this book deserve Mount Doom? Is obviously no. It's a good book, and I would really recommend it to anyone who has an interest in the Star Wars EU, or even is just looking for a general sci-fi flick. You probably won't enjoy it as much if you aren't at least somewhat versed in Star Wars. At the very least, know what the Clone Wars is. It is a book I would recommend reading for various reasons. I actually like the idea of focusing on the war from the perspective of the people not fighting on the front lines. Like I said, I do warn that it is pretty jargon heavy at times. It does reference a lot of deep lore stuff that you probably won't understand unless you're super into the EU already, at which point you probably have already read this. Like, for example, I would put money down that I-5 was in other books, too. Well, I mean, I've already put a lot of money down, so I might be broke. But anyways, I would recommend this to anyone with an interest in the EU. But with that being said, the Republic falls, becoming the Empire. The Jedi are hunted to near extinction by Order 66. And the Empire begins to grip the galaxy in a Durasteel grip. I said grip twice. Whatever. Is it just me, or is that a small moon coming forward? Wait a minute. That's no moon. Until then, remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones.